Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Ohio Huntsman Podcast. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about hunting tactics as the season progresses. So we kind of talked before the show. We're going to break it up, keep it simple. A lot of these hunting formats talk about a lot of different phases, and we sort of subscribe more to simple phases: early season, rut, and late season. And there's some little micro changes within each of those, but we're just going to kind of talk through the tactics, the kind of places or the kind of spots that we like to hunt during those phases, and see where the conversation takes us. So, like I said, we're going to start with early season, which we're kind of calling the start of season through late October, early November as rut kicks in. So, Jeff, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Sure. So early in the season, the spot that I like to hunt, the spot I'm going to be focusing on the most this year, I have a spot that is in between a bedding area and then a premium food source, which is an apple tree. And then that apple tree is on the edge of a ag field that's planted in corn this year.
Let's back up one step. How have you identified that it's a bedding area, this bedding area you talked of?
In years past, I've jumped a lot of deer out of there that were bedded down. I've made
Fair
the
enough.
mistakes,
Fair enough. Okay. And so what does that look like? Is it like what kind of cover or terrain, or what? Explain what it looks like.
This area is it's a brushy area. It has a lot of tall grasses it's adjacent to a wetland. And the deer tend to stay out of the wetland, but they like to bed along the edge there. There's a lot of brush, and I don't know what the plant is, but there's some tall summer grasses that grow, and even well into the winter, they are still standing, 4 foot tall. So it's very easy for the deer to just lay down and be out of the wind, be out of sight. So that's the bedding area.
It's not a wooded area. It's a high brushy area. So at start of season, some stuff is still green in there?
Yes. Most of it, at the start of season, most of it is still green. Yeah.
Okay.
Is this the same area that you had that deer last year that basically wouldn't run away? That's
yes,
the same area?
Exact same
That's
place, yes.
Area. Okay.
Yes, I had a deer in there that I jumped it, it stood up, but it apparently didn't think that I was a threat or that I saw it through the brush and the grass, so it just stood there and stared at me for a long, long time.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the tactic. So you're setting up between bedding and food early season. That's what you like to do.
I like to look for what I call, premium food sources, because there's still a lot of food in the woods, So, I look for something where, the thing that the deer are going to prefer to eat, because there's a lot of food still available.
Mm-hmm.
So that apple tree is very enticing to them.
Okay.
They want to come eat those apples, and then they'll move their way on, out to the field to, eat the corn or whatever's in the field that year, as at night, more or less, as it gets darker, they move out into the field. I probably would hunt right on the apple tree, but the apple tree is on the property line. And the other thing is I want to try to catch the deer more in daylight hours.
Yeah.
When they get to the apple tree, it's typically dusk. It's still legal shooting light, but if I can just kind of move down their trail, I can catch them earlier.
So early season, you're hunting primarily evenings?
Primarily evenings, and that's more or less out of convenience than anything else. But it works kind of both ways, because at night they're feeding in the field, and then they're trying to typically go back to the bedding for the day. So it does kind of work both ways.
So for me, I'll probably be hunting for early season, be hunting the property out east or this new property that I have access to that I have not stepped foot on yet. So this weekend, actually, I plan to go out there and look around for the first time, do some scouting. I know it's kind of late, but that's just how the schedule worked out. And so I'll be glad to get out there and look around a little bit. But I think that's a good tactic, what you mentioned, trying to get between bedding and food. I think the keys to that are identifying bedding, which is why I was asking you to explain that a little bit. And like you said, that most desirable food source, because there's still a lot of food around. And there's a sub phase or a sub shift within that early season if you're in crop country when the crops come off, or when the beans start to yellow, because they're not really desirable to deer when the beans start to yellow until then late season when they've dried out and they're after the pods. Early season they'd be eating the leaves and stuff. Jake, anything you want to add to early season tactics that we haven't covered?
The only thing I could think is from experience, agriculture fields aren't always, that's your quick and easy food source, but they're not always the best early season food source, because a lot of times, just out of bad luck, I guess, the beans typically yellow the week before opening day. So the deer are transitioning out of the beans, and a lot of times it's too hot for them to eat a lot of corn. Corn, the way that they metabolize it raises their body temperature. So opening day, it's still pretty warm usually. Not that the deer aren't using the fields, they are. But like Jeff was saying, there's a premium food. So sometimes it's better to find things like oak trees, the acorns, the mass crop. If it's a high mass crop year, the apples, that's like candy to a deer. So sometimes that is more important than, you could set up between bedding and a crop field and you'll never see a deer because they don't get to that crop field till well after dark, just because they're eating what they prefer first, which is sometimes in the timber, sometimes it's apple trees, sometimes, different things. But that's probably about it. It sounds like you guys hit on, typically early season, you're bed to food, food to bed, and you want to be in the middle.
The other thing I just thought of that's nice about early season is a lot of your camera pictures leading up to the start of season still hold some value before hunting pressure or gun season or the rut has thrown them off of those patterns, or the crops have come out of the fields. That's another, you go from having, in a cornfield, tons of cover, and when they cut the corn, it's a barren wasteland now, and that'll change their movement. So with that being said, the next sort of phase or sub-season of the deer season that we're going to talk about is the rut. So everybody loves to hunt the rut. There's typically, elevated daytime activity, bucks chasing does, hopefully, and it's a great time to be in the woods if you can be in the woods on one of those days where the deer are moving and you just never know what's going to come by. So tactics on rut hunting. Jake, you want to start?
Sure, I'll take the start on this one. Primarily for the rut, the old adage or old saying goes, find the does and the bucks will follow. I guess just for completeness sake, not all of our listeners may be familiar. The rut is the deer breeding season. So the does go into heat or estrus, and the bucks come from miles away to find them. So typically a lot of times it's bedding again, because the does, typically bedding is thicker, as Jeff stated previously, and until the does are ready to be bred, which is actually a fairly short window of time, the bucks kind of pester them and bully them around. So the does actually try and get away. So a lot of times they're going into that thick bedding area to hide from the bucks, just like they would hide from you and I walking through the woods. They see the bucks as not necessarily a threat, dangerous, but they don't want the bucks picking on them because the bucks are going to try and breed them.
Right, nudging them around.
Right. So what the bucks will do then is they will go downwind of those bedding areas, trying to get scent or to wind to see if there's any does in that bedding area that have come into estrus. Typically, the deer go into estrus at slightly variable times. I mean, it's not every deer in Ohio doesn't go into estrus on, November 9th or whatever the date, pick a day. Depends on who you ask as to when the rut is. I mean, there's all kinds of variability. You can look it up online. It's been 3 days. Researching the rut, that is the prime deer hunting time. But typically, you want to be hunting just off of bedding. The bucks are typically going to be cruising, as they call it, or traveling downwind for the most part of these bedding areas, because what they're trying to do is scent check the does in there and see, are there any in here that are worth going in there and
they're ready to be bred.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any in there worth going in for, or should I move on to the next bedding area? So if you can get downwind of the bedding area, a lot of times the deer will be traveling and walking through. So basically, for the rut, you're looking for high traffic areas, places you've seen a lot of sign, trails, commonly used trails. Deer, if they don't know you're in the woods, they're going to use their normal trails. They have no reason not to.
Right.
So you hunt off of trails, typically surrounding bedding areas, preferably downwind. Obviously, the wind direction changes by day, sometimes throughout the day.
Yeah, and so I guess to expand on that point a little bit, like you kind of want to be on the downwind of the downwind side, if that makes sense. So you're hoping to be you're hoping that
the bucks to walk between you and the bed.
Correct. Yeah. So you need to kind of know where that edge is. They're going to travel the edge. Deer are creatures of the edge, and you want to be within bow range of that edge where you think the buck is going to cruise through to scent check that area. The other tactic, if you will, for that is, like Jacob mentioned, the high traffic areas, sort of the pinch points or the funnels. If you can identify those can be super hot spots to hunt during the rut.
Yeah. I personally more subscribe to finding the high traffic trails and worry less about the bedding. With my personal, I try to find the most high traffic trail, the deer highway. And sometimes it's a deer highway, it's a very high traffic trail that all the movement's at night. Well, during the rut, sometimes those trails become very popular in the middle of the day, because the deer completely switch. And then again, pinch points. I really like to look for pinch points, creek crossings, patches of woods that, are in between two fields, that, it's cover so that they're not out in the open, or patches of woods that kind of connect to larger areas of woods. I prefer hunting the pinch points and, the most trafficked trail I can find.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can find like an overgrown river bottom or something that is fields on either side, but it's kind of the connector between two wood lots, that could be a great spot during the rut. I know I didn't get a shot, but I was set up in a position like that 2 years ago and had an encounter with a pretty decent buck in a situation like that. Then if you have some terrain helps identify those pinch points. So you've got just fields and geography in that sense, but like down in southern Ohio, you've got some terrain that if you've got like a low spot where the ridge is easier to get across, that could be a good spot. The deer are going to cross in the easy spot. So those are all good spots for the rut hunt. Anything else we want to add before we move on? No,
I don't believe so.
One thing with hunting the rut, don't be discouraged to hunt the place where you haven't seen deer, the rest of the season, because a lot of those places can be very productive during the rut.
Right.
Go ahead and hunt that kind of obscure spot you have that there's all kinds of sign, but you never see a deer, or or maybe you don't have a whole lot of land to hunt, and for those people, the rut, that's the time you want to be out there, or there's no deer there. But if during the rut, sometimes those are the hot spots.
Right. Yeah. So the rut then kind of leads us, in Ohio at least, into gun season. As the rut's tapering off, gun season kicks in. Gun season, I would say for a lot of people that hunt in Ohio, is a big variable. It depends on how much land you have. If you've got a big chunk of land that you have to manage yourself, then maybe it's not as big of a variable. But I know for us and the properties we hunt, after the rut, gun season comes in, and it's kind of a hit or miss. We typically spend at least the first half of the week down in southern Ohio. Like we've mentioned before, lots of guys in the woods. Scent control isn't great or non-existent. A lot of deer drives down there, and that's just the culture, and it's all good, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as far as patterning a deer during gun season in those kind of scenarios, I'd say it's impossible. I hate to say anything's impossible, but I would say those scenarios, it's kind of the luck of the draw. You just put yourself in a spot where you've seen good deer. I think we've talked before where on public land you can kind of try to think about where you've seen other hunters before and how they're accessing the woods and where they may be pushing deer as they're coming in and out of the woods. If you can sit all day during gun season, that lunch hour can be hot because guys are coming down out of the woods and moving deer around. And so I guess we kind of did a short little bonus time of the year because we talked about early season, rut, and late season. But gun season is sort of a season in and of itself. So you guys have any other thoughts on gun season, Jeff?
Well, for me, gun season, the primary strategy for that, especially in high pressure areas, is find the escape route. A lot of, there's a lot of guys going into the woods, and basically try to find that route that they're going to take to cover, whether it's a property that no one hunts, or if it's, maybe a more urban area, or suburban area towards a housing development or a housing, towards town where the deer know if I go there, I'm not getting shot at. Try to find those escape routes where the deer are trying to get away,
Right.
And a lot of times you don't need to go far into the woods. The guy who sits, 50 yards from the road, sometimes is the most successful guy because he's catching, everybody's going deep into the woods and pushing the deer out of the woods.
Right. Jake, anything you want to add on gun season?
Just like you said, it's a kind of a crapshoot. It's a complete variable as to what. It depends who's in the woods, when they're in the woods, how much shooting. Because on top of that, even if there's not necessarily guys near you, as soon as guns start going off, that affects the deer movement.
Yeah.
So pretty much, I guess it's similar to the rut in the sense of where you want to be in the woods as much as possible, because you never know what's going to happen. You never know when you're going to see a deer because they're not acting normal in the sense of their normal activities where your high activity points are daylight and dusk.
Right.
Yes, if you happen to catch one at first light in the morning of opening day, it might be sort of acting normal, assuming no other hunters had walked through its bedding. But primarily outside of that, you're just trying to catch them. They're just running around for their lives, and you're hoping that they run by you. At least where we hunt down at the cabin, down south. It's just too many guys, too much pressure, too much noise, cars, the whole nine. Those deer are just running around, kind of trying to stay alive.
Well, and the one thing that's a constant for gun season, it's going to be a good time. It's going to be exciting. So with that, then I guess we'll move on to late season. So late season, we're kind of calling anything after gun season, things calm down. There is another, they've played around with it here the past couple of years, but this extended gun season or a late gun season that I don't think gets hunted as much as the week-long gun season, but it's a factor to be considered. But so for late season, what are you guys' tactics? Jeff, do you want to?
This time of year, it's all about available food. The deer are really trying to fatten up for winter, especially the bucks who have just spent, a couple of weeks chasing all the does, and then another week being chased around by a bunch of hunters. They're tired and they're hungry.
Right.
They need to build those fat reserves that they've burnt off chasing does and running from hunters. So food sources are big now, and now it goes into a lot more of they're going to the ag fields, trying to get what the combines missed, and maybe that one oak tree that wasn't, as preferred earlier in the season, that still has a couple of acorns on the ground. They're going there, and just anywhere where they can find reliable food.
Yeah. And I think especially I don't want to say that it's not good in December, because that's not what I'm saying, but if you can find a good food source come, mid-January, dude, that can be dynamite, if you can stand the cold, because if you can find the food source around, everything in the area has to come there, and it can be the mecca.
Yeah. And a lot of times late season, the evening sit is a lot better, I've found, than in the morning.
Yeah.
And the good thing about late season, if you will, with it being so cold, is a lot of times you can pretty well set your watch to when the deer are moving. They are coming at this time every evening. That's when the deer are entering the field. So I just need to be out there, on a day where they come in.
Yep.
Yeah, and another thing with late season, and again, this is variable as to how people feel one way or the other, but at the end of the day, it's legal in Ohio. Baiting deer or putting out food for the deer is a very good way to get deer in the late season, just because food is at a premium. So if you're someone who hunts a feeder, like Jeff was saying, you can pretty well set your watch to when those deer are going to come to the feeder, especially a lot of the modern, electronic feeders. You can set timers on them, and I've heard stories, I've never personally seen it, where the deer can hear that feeder spooling, throwing corn out, and it's like, domestic
Ringing
cattle.
the dinner bell.
Yeah, and they just come out of the woodwork coming to eat at the feeder. That's not, I've never personally hunted over a feeder like that and had that type of success or reaction. But if you're someone who hunts a feeder, sometimes the late season is, the easiest time to get whatever survives the rut in terms of bucks or mature deer. They have to eat, so it's a good time to get those animals on their feet. And they got to come, they're kind of a slave to their stomach at that point, because like Jeff said, they have utilized all of their energy reserves trying to survive the rut. Because not only, Jeff didn't mention this, they're chasing does, but prior to that process and kind of throughout the rut, they're also fighting each other for the does, which uses a lot of energy. The bucks are sparring, and depending on how your buck to doe ratio is, if there's just not that many does to go around, everybody wants to breed the doe. So the bigger, stronger, there can be some throwdowns over the does. So that also takes a bunch of energy out of them.
Yeah. So I think we kind of covered everything we wanted to cover. Is there anything else we want to add before we wrap up?
No, I think that's pretty good synopsis of the different seasons. Obviously, or parts of the season. You obviously could And like I said, you could go into mega detail about different sub-phases of the phases. Depends on who you ask or what website or person you're listening to. But I think that's kind of a general consensus. Early season, you want to kind of catch them bed to food on their normal, quote-unquote, summer pattern still. When you get to the rut, you just want to be in the woods, basically, high traffic area. In late season, you want to hunt food. It's just locating the food and kind of going from there. And that's pretty general consensus across the board. Anyone who spends much time in the woods will kind of agree with those things. It's kind of the sub-phases and getting into the moon and temperature and barometric pressure. And like I said, you could spend forever talking about that stuff, but that's a pretty good high level.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, I think we'll wrap up. We appreciate all the support. Please subscribe to the show. Share it on your social platforms. Follow us on Facebook at Ohio Huntsman, and we're on Instagram at Ohio Huntsman Podcast. And just want to thank everybody for all the support, and thanks for listening.